Pleasure to be here as Henry. We're going to talk about the lighthouse keepers and the lighthouses themselves. So first thing you might wonder, well, who's Ed? Is Ed Henry Gatai or is Ed William Duclon? Could have an identity crisis. I also am Captain Duclon over at Eagle Bluff, and actually Mrs. Duclon is Ann Sheridan plays Mrs. Duclon, and she taught me all about being Captain Duclon. So I guess no real identity crisis. Here's Dwight and Ed over at the range light when we took the stairway out. Kind of stepping back, Leanne said my great-grandfather settled here. This is a picture at a known Bailey's Harbor landmark with my Uncle Carl and my grandfather in there. And maybe the next picture will help give you a better idea. It's my dad in the middle and Uncle Carl on the other side. Al's Tavern. Anybody know what Al's Tavern is now? Al Onsorger had that.
Same initials.
AC Tap. So lighthouses started. Our lighthouses. This is a Western Great Lakes lighthouse map. 11th Lighthouse District is what we were back in 1882, and most of our lighthouses, except there were two that weren't in place by then. This little map gives you an idea where the Bailey's Harbor had 3 lighthouse stations. 2 are still active. The Cana Island Lighthouse Station, use the pointer, out here, the old lighthouse here, and the range lights over here. There was a very treacherous passage into Bailey's Harbor. You had to watch you didn't get hung up on the shoals or the sandbars. So the path that you wanted to get in, you stayed in here. And this was actually what the Coast Guard used on the navigation charts for when the leading marker was over there, and there are 2 buoys out here. You got between those buoys and you headed toward that marker and you got safely into the harbor. Pretty much the same with the range lights. Bailey's Harbor, the story goes, it's named after, and Dwight can jump in here if he thinks, because it's named, Captain Bailey sailed in here. He was looking for a harbor of refuge. He got in miraculously, I guess, safely, and he went back to his boss, Allenson Sweet, and told him what kind of resources we have here. The federal government awarded Sweet a contract to construct a lighthouse on the island on the south side of the harbor. Went into operation in 1853. Well, that lighthouse was maybe put in the wrong place. It might have caused more shipwrecks than it did good.
Just so you know, Allison Sweet is a New Yorker, and he moved to the Midwest to seek his fortune, and he was good at it. He resided primarily in Milwaukee, and his business plan was very simple: own nothing, control everything. So folks like Captain Bailey worked as contractors. They owned their vessel, but they contracted with Sweet to provide cargo and provide income for his company in turn for the profit that they would make. Sweet's standing order to his captains was simply this: that the captain of any vessel employed by the firm shall at all times be mindful of that which is of benefit to the firm. In other words, look out for good stuff. And Captain Bailey certainly did that in finding timber and stone in the Bailey's Harbor area.
So there's the Birdcage Lighthouse. Right now it's privately owned. It's still very substantial. The tower on there, 3 feet thick at the bottom, tapering to 2 feet thick at the top. It began in 1852 when limestone from Sweet's Quarry was used to construct the tower and the keeper's dwelling. tower height is 52 feet from the ground to its focal plane. So in 1866, an inspector for the 11th Lighthouse District announced that the deteriorated Bailey's Harbor lighthouse needed to be rebuilt. So they allocated $15,000 for that. The funds were appropriated, the project approved, but they decided that maybe we could do something better. So the funds were put towards the Bailey's Harbor Range Light and the Cana Island Light Station. And here's where Dwight takes over. This is his expertise.
All righty. This is home. Let me get my buttons. Yeah, that's cool too. The picture you see is modern. This is the way this station looked in the latter part of 1980s, 86 through 89. The changes that came along, it says, majestic white tower, brick keeper's dwelling closely resembles the image of people have of a lighthouse. And that is most certainly true today. More often than not, throughout the course of a day, someone will comment on, well, this one looks like a real lighthouse, mainly because it's got a tower. Trick question for you. Cana Island overall height is 89.5 feet. Is that the tallest lighthouse in Door County? In fact, there's two that are taller. One of which is out on Rock Island. It's called Potawatomi Light. And so wait a minute, that's just got a little light that sticks right up above the roof. How can that be taller? And the answer is lighthouses are measured by their focal plane, how far the light is above the water. If you take that little tower out at Potawatomi Light and you stick 142 feet of bluff underneath it, and suddenly it's a lot taller. Second tallest after that would be the Canal Station Light in Sturgeon Bay, and poor little Cana comes in third. Cana is about 9 acres in size. Ladies and gentlemen, that's variable. Acreage is measured as that part which is above water. As you may have noticed lately, there's been a change in the amount of water available, and Cana is now holding up to its name and is in fact an island. Built in 1869, actually, 1869 was a good year. Cana was built, the front and rear ranges of the Bailey's Harbor Range Light was built. Now, in case of Cana's sake, that was all masonry. Tower, house, there were wood structures for the outbuildings, and it was the 19th century. And something happened in that century that you probably may not find today. Cana's structure was entirely, for the complete station, was completed in 4.5 months. That's 6 weeks ahead of schedule and approximately 15% under budget. And yes, it was a federal project. Things were a little different. There's a lot of pride back then, the fact that the structures are still standing. Hopefully, but there was flooding. Now you'd think that when you built your light tower at the top of the highest point of the island, this would solve that problem. Well, folks, the highest point of the island, especially in the 19th century, when lake levels were higher, is a whopping 6 feet, 6 inches above at mean lake level. As you may be aware, Lake Michigan is capable of raising waves in excess of 20 feet. This does a lot of damage to the lawn. In all seriousness, the way they fixed it was they hired men with teams to bring in additional soil and move the level of the ground up. This didn't totally prevent flooding, it just sort of rearranged it. Well, they filled in an acre of land, and perhaps more importantly, they built an oil house. Well, all light stations have oil houses. That's not new. But Cana's lighthouse is extremely special. It's got 6-sided. It is the only 6-sided oil house of any light station in North America. That includes Canada and Mexico. That in one makes it special. It also is made entirely out of Dolomite limestone. Any guesses where they found that? It was quarried right on the island. All right, so that was a big part of it. We got our new railing, and you can read this as well as I can. The last line I'd like to share with you on this particular slide is that a footbridge was added to provide access to the mainland. Well, that occurred in fall of 1890. Upon return in the spring of 1891, no sign of the bridge was found. So the lake had its way and once again rearranged things. And there's some specifics in here about the foundation. You can read about that certainly. What's wonderful about Cana is that copper dome they talk about, the lantern they talk about, all of that is still here. This light was lit as a test in November of 1869. There was further testing and alignments in the winter of 1870. And on the 1st of April, 1870, Cana became a navigational aid. That was our first navigational lighting. Last time it was lit as a chartered navigational aid. Well, it hasn't happened quite yet. It's coming up in about an hour and 20 minutes. This is our 147th year of continuous service, and that service is provided by the original optics as installed in 1869. We use a Fresnel lens, and Ed and I will tell you a little bit more, probably more than you're looking for about Fresnel lenses. What it does is provide a very efficient means of transmitting light. It bends or folds the light. In our case of Cana, it uses 168 separate prisms. Just for point of interest, should you wish to move it, it is 2,190 pounds of glass. It came probably with a phrase we're familiar with today, some assembly required. Now the brickwork is very, very native to the Milwaukee area. It's called Cream City and also nicknamed Milwaukee brick. The tower was made of the same brick as the house. The new privy, that would be the 1892 privy, which is all brick, two-hole top of the line. Anyway, that was Cream City brick as well. One of the wonderful things about Cream City brick is it's beautifully decorative. It is not a hot-fired brick, so it's, in terms of brick, kind of soft. It is wonderful for decorating the house, the fascia applied to a house or an office. However, should you wish to build a light tower out of it, and you leave that light tower exposed to the elements, it just doesn't work that good. So Cana is one of two lighthouses on the Great Lakes. Au Sable Light near Ludington, Michigan is also built of Cream City brick, and it got the same thing that we did here, and that is metal cladding was applied to the outside. The metal cladding is assembled just the way a ship hull is. It's hot riveted. Imagine a ship hull turned inside out. The seams or gussets are on the outside, and the smooth part faces the brick. In between that and the original outside brick wall is cement. I know it says concrete on the slide, but it's a very fine aggregate, very similar to a brick mortar as opposed to a concrete. Tower had been painted white. Well, guess what? No, it wasn't. Tower originally had been painted tan or cream, tannish kind of cream colored to mimic the color of the brick. Well, during World War II, the Coast Guard came out, and it says training activities on here, but you know what they were doing? It's called Coast Watch. Coast Watch is part of security. Remember coming out of Twin Port and Escanaba was iron ore, and that iron ore was destined down lake to the 6 major steel mills that resided in northwestern Indiana. Any interruption in that flow of raw material is an interruption in the flow of finished steel. And steel, most assuredly, during World War II, was definitely a war material. And that's why there was a Coast Guard, or Coast Watch, established at Cana. 2 reasons. One, to be on the look for any waterborne saboteur, and 2, to provide security for the light itself. Remember, In today's world, we use GPS and we use radar. Well, radar in World War II was top secret. That was new technology. So those ore boats carrying that very important war material, they navigated by lighthouses. So there was a security concern as well. Huge jump from 1940s up into the 1970s. Louis and Rosie Janda are a pair of teachers that taught in the Green Bay School District for basically their entire careers. But in the summer they came out to Cana, initially as volunteers. Matter of fact, they worked really for just the use of the property. And Louis was responsible for a lot of the daily maintenance that allowed the station to be preserved. Because back in 1939, the station was automated, and there really wasn't need for a daily keeper. Louis and Rosie took care of the grounds, the structures, and raised a family in the summer months. It wasn't that long ago that their youngest daughter got married. Last summer, the next generation of Jandas came out. She brought her daughter back. Daughter's 2 years old. It says 1883. That's an estimated date. This is the oldest known photograph of Cana. Tower is still in brick. The top is painted black. This thing is called a lower gallery. There's an upper gallery around the lens. And then you've got the house itself. The first privy, later replaced with the brick one. This is a summer's kitchen and 2 additional bedrooms. This is what we call the old barn. Old barn being the 1870s barn as opposed to the 1898 barn, which is the new barn. 1913. Well, this is post-1902, which means the steel is on. You notice something else? It's not painted white. White paint didn't happen until the Coast Guard, Coastal Watch, then Coast Guard, became the caretakers of Cana Station. And being efficient and being young men who probably were not thrilled with the idea of painting an 89-foot tall tower, they solved the problem of how to paint it by painting everything white. So the black trim became white, the top became white, the steel cladding became white. Thankfully, they didn't paint the lens. The top part, this is copper, and that's the original copper as installed in 1869. Afterwards, both Ed and I will talk about the restoration of our 2 stations and what's going on. Suffice to say that copper is now back the way it was, and more importantly, no longer leaks. Okay, range lights. We've got upper lights and lower lights. That's kind of the ridges names. From a navigation standpoint, they're called rear and front. Front being closest to the water, and rear being the furthest away. With that, it's time for the other lighthouse in Bailey's Harbor.
Here we have a survey map of the range light station done in 1887. We'll zoom in a little bit. And you can see where the front light is in relation to the rear light. We'll get in a little closer. You see the compound around the rear light. There's a shed that's there, the privy, and a barn. The barn's no longer there. The privy probably isn't where it used to be, and actually we have a really modern convenience there. We have a well now. 1884 that well went in. Thought this map was kind of interesting because you look at the shoreline in 1878, and look where it is in 1936. Everybody wonders, why was that light built so far back from the water? Well, actually, when it was the front range light was built, it really wasn't that far back from the water. It's sitting right here. We're fortunate to have copies of the original drawings for our range lights. What's interesting is we're one of 6 pairs of these range lights that were built on the western Great Lakes. As a matter of fact, if you look at this drawing, they repurposed it. It used to say Grand Island Harbor. They crossed that out and wrote Bailey's Harbor, and they crossed out Lake Superior and wrote in Lake Michigan. So there's our front range light. The original, the transmittal letter of when this was sent to the Lighthouse Board by engineer General Reynolds. It is actually Reynolds, not Reynolds. Supplies. How did supplies and the materials get here to build these lighthouses? Well, roads weren't all that great. Everything came out of the Lighthouse Depot. It was our Lighthouse Depot that serviced us was in Detroit. The Hyacinth was one of the tenders that visited the range lights on the Great Lakes. We found, this is rather interesting. When Roy Lucas was living in the range light, he thought it was really dark in the kitchen, and he thought, well, it'd really be nice to have a window on that north wall. So he got permission from the Coast Guard to put a window in. And when they took the siding off, they came across the signature board of the carpenter that was responsible for the building of our lighthouse. And one of the things I like is how he signed it October 20, T8th, whatever, 1869. Try to say that quick. And he was from Detroit, Michigan. One of the things that came out of the National Archives is we found out some important dates at our lighthouse. When the funds were allocated, when it was built, when the well went in, when some of the fences went up. Just very fortunate having that type of information. The other thing that happened is lighthouse inspectors came around and inspected the lighthouses once a year. They always wrote a report. This one was done in 1909 for the Bailey's Harbor Range Light, and there was a lot of, say, a boilerplate form and filled in the information appropriate to the particular lighthouse that he was at. This is our earliest picture, known picture of the Bailey's Harbor upper or rear range light, 1883. Some interesting things. The white shed is not there anymore today, but when it got in such a bad condition that it was torn down, the one that we replicated and put up there is very similar. It looks like that same little building. Here's our privy back here. It's a comfortable 2-holer. It's not brick like what they've got out on Cana Island, but it suits its purpose. A little later picture of the range light. Here's our keeper, Henry Gattai, standing there. A friend and his dog visiting the lighthouse. And you'll notice some couple different things in this one. The color is different up on the top, and now it's got 2 windows. We don't really have any record of when they went in. We just know they showed up between 1883 and 1907. Another view of the lighthouse from the front with its fence, and the pole where the maritime warning flags went up. Here's Henry dressed maybe a little more casually than what you see him dressed here tonight. A little better view of that flagpole. The other thing I like to point out is that the ventilator ball, for some reason, changed shape. It was more cylindrical. Now it's round. A picture from the lighthouse that came from the National Archives, taken in 1913, and it really doesn't look that much different today than what it does now, except we don't have the ventilator ball anymore, and the chimney was redone. It does have the basement entrance. Here's our oil house, not octagonal. Like Dwight said, they got the only one, or hexagonal.
Hexagonal.
Only 6-sided one in the service. Here's our privy, and the lighthouse keepers' garden here. Lighthouse keepers supplemented their food rations that they got from the lighthouse service with their gardens. Here's that barn. It's an undated photo. There is a truck in here, probably sometime in the 1910s, 1920s that might have been taken. Barn no longer stands where it is. It's gone, but this barn showed up later. It was up there until it disappeared in 1990, where it was falling apart, attached to the back side of the shed. But when you look at the pictures, it looks like they may be, the window's identical, and you count the number of boards and battens, they're identical. That barn must have been moved from where it originally was and shortened up. An interesting aerial view that we got courtesy of the National Archives from 1947. Here we can see our oil house out here, upper range light, Highway 57, going on up the peninsula. A view of it as it looked when Roy Lucas was living there. One of the interesting things is the vestibule that is on the range light now is not there back then. And notice the ventilator ball is gone. There was always a boardwalk connecting the upper and lower range light of one type or another. This is how it looked in 1910, how it looked in the 1960s. Now, I said that one of 6 that were built in the western Great Lakes. Copper Harbor up on Lake Superior looks like a lot like our rear range light. It has an even fancier ventilator ball on it than what we had. There's the pair of the Copper Harbor range lights. A little different, they've got a front window, a window on the lower level on the face facing the lake. Looks an awful lot like ours. Unfortunately, there's Copper Harbor today. But to say ours are the only pair of range lights that sit intact relative to one another. Eagle Harbor had a pair of range lights, their front range light, their rear range light. The thing I find interesting about this picture, that picture that we have from the National Archives in 1913, there was a ladder on the roof in the same place as what they've got here, so I wonder what's going on there. Porch is a little bit different, and it's built up a lot higher. Here's what Eagle Harbor looks like today. It lost its kitchen, and the front porch is actually a walk-through bathroom. Put in some different windows on the side. Grand Island is a very unique one. They needed a higher tower. I just love the walkway around there. But unfortunately, that's what Grand Island Harbor looks like today. Presque Isle, another range light. Their front porch looks a little wider than ours, and their front range light was redone, nicely redone, but it's not sitting where it used to. So just what happens in the life and day of a lighthouse keeper. Well, it's not always a party. Here I am right here, and the waiter's serving up quart bottles of Miller High Life beer. Lighthouse service had specific instructions for their keepers. It was a fairly thick book that spelled out everything that had to be done at a lighthouse. And what were those things? Well, we got uniforms in 1884. The Lighthouse Service wanted us to be presentable when we talked to groups such as yourself. Keepers had to wear their uniforms whenever they appeared in public. When they worked, they had work clothes. What were some of the duties? Well, the main duty is keep the lights burning. So in 1870, the fuel at the Bailey's Harbor range lights was lard. Lard isn't the cleanest fuel to burn. Doesn't last very long. It lasted about 3 hours on a fill if you were lucky. So consider the fact that the keeper was up a lot at night. He had to keep not only the rear range light lit, but he had to walk down that 950-foot boardwalk and replenish the fuel in the front range light. It wasn't too bad, though. The lights weren't lit all year round. They were lit when the harbor froze over. They were extinguished for the season, and they were relit when the ice went out the following navigation season. In 1880, the fuel changed to mineral oil, known as kerosene. A little better, the fuel in there only had to be replenished, say, every 6 hours. So maybe the keeper could get a nap in between. That would a little better than when we burned lard. They were automated with acetylene in 1923. They used a thing called a sun valve, where the sun activated it, turned the light on and off. When that happened, our light station was no longer required to be manned, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into Henry himself. Electricity in 1930. Well, the keeper also had to maintain the lights. Those lighthouse regulations required it to be sparkling clean and polished by 10 o'clock in the morning. They had to keep the lights in repair, maintain the lighthouse in the grounds. When you're in the lighthouse service, you did a lot of painting. Buildings to repair, and then also as a federal establishment, lighthouse keepers had to welcome any and all visitors. So, paperwork, keepers had a lot of official reports to submit to the district office. In addition to all these, keepers kept a log. The log was mainly weather-related and conditions out on the lake. Might had some things in there about when the inspector was there or if the district lampist was there to repair the lights. Keepers were also provided with rations delivered by the tender, and this shows what the annual allowance per man for 1881 was. It didn't matter how many were in your family. Out on Cana Island, Jesse Brown, I believe, had, 6 boys? Mm-hmm. They still got that same ration.
Allowances are for the employee. If you take the word man out and substitute employee, ration allowance is for the employee. The family was expected to self-provide.
So families had gardens, and some hunted and fished. The other thing is, well, how do you connect with what's going on? The Lighthouse Service had traveling libraries that were rotated from lighthouse to lighthouse periodically. Everyone was numbered, so they just kind of sent them along in sequence. That's what the inside of one of those boxes looked like with the literature of the time, sometimes journals and magazines. And then we'll get to the lighthouse keepers themselves. The Old Bailey's Harbor Lighthouse had 5 keepers. We found out a few things about some of them. David Ward, appointed 1853 when it went into operation. He was replaced in 1854 by Michael Green. Only served 6 months before passing away in 1855. Kind of like that name, Newton Bacon. That has a certain ring to it. Was the next keeper. And the last keeper, William Darling, was appointed when Mitchell was transferred to another lighthouse. He served in the 6th Regiment in Wisconsin. And that kind of gives you an idea where later on a lot of lighthouse keepers came out of were veterans of the Civil Wars, or maybe the earlier war, the Mexican-American War. Do you want to talk about your Cana Island keepers?
Oh, yeah.
They had quite a few keepers there.
They only had 7. The first one, William Jackson, he was the guy responsible for the opening of the station. Now, Mr. Jackson's claim to fame was simply this: he had absolutely no experience in the lighthouse business. He was, however, a Civil War veteran, a wounded veteran. And you're thinking, oh, we're so sorry. Keep in mind that Mr. Jackson's wounds did not prohibit him from opening a business, running a store, and operating a farm. So he's in fairly good shape. He managed to get his wife appointed as assistant keeper, and she had less experience than he did. How can this happen? I thought promotion came up through the ranks. It was, after all, a congressional appointment. Well, Mr. Jackson had one other activity that he was involved with. And he was what we would call today a state committee chairman for his party. That would be the New Republic. That's Abraham Lincoln's party, who had been in power the last 12 years. I'm not saying that there's a connection here, but state committee chair, active in party, on the board of the National Convention, gets a $1,000 a year job. Fortunately, that kind of stuff doesn't happen today. All right, 18th, 1883. A hurricane and cyclone strikes Cana Island, tearing everything movable to pieces. Well, no, it was not a cyclone, and yes, Cana is one of the few places in the Midwest that on occasion does record hurricane force winds. That sounds outrageous. Hurricane force wind only has to be 118 miles an hour. So you got that working for us. And 2 vessels were disabled. Well, that means they got wiped out on the shoals. Well, Mr. Warren replaced Jackson in 1872, and following the same scheme of things, got Sarah appointed as his assistant. Big difference between the two, Julius Warren actually knew something about lighthouses. Both he and his wife had prior postings. Like all lighthouses keepers, they saw minor repairs and took care of things and get down to that last sentence and were removed from their posts. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the only news we have about Julius Warren's and Sarah Warren's departure. They were dismissed. Keep going. Okay. The Sanderson clan. William was good. Of the records we have in the log of Cana Station, Williams are outstanding. Not typically, by requirement, the keeper was required to log conditions of the station. What's working, what's broke, ships passing, what is the weather. Now, a couple of, one, and we'll come to a little bit further, who's administered the log in a very efficient style. He wrote weather fair to Midland, seen vessels, and then 30 days of ditto marks. That was not Sanderson's case, though. We'll talk a little bit about Clifford as we go along. Clifford got into the line of work, too. Moving along, he was not happy with the station incident. They called it inhospitable. He claimed it was lonely. It's right down the bay. Before we leave Sanderson and his concerns about loneliness, and we'll talk about the gale in a moment, Cana was considered, with the exception of Mr. Sanderson, to be a good duty station. It is a row, meaning take your rowboat and come into town. At the time, out there next across Spikehorn Bay, you've got a place called Booze Point. You got a boat launch there today. In the 19th century, there was a town, and it contained pretty much everything you needed. The only occupation in the town was fishing. But you could row into town in about 10 minutes. In a sailing skiff, you could come into Bailey's Harbor, which at that time had one of the largest populations in Door County. Matter of fact, very quick story from our log. Towns, plural, this is after services on Sunday afternoon, held picnic at station this day, Sunday afternoon. Monday, Tuesday. The Tuesday log reads, finished cleaning station after town's picnic. They partied well. Alpena, and the Alpena gale. Alpena is not named for the town. The gale is named for the vessel that sank with the most lives lost, the Alpena, which was a sidewheel steamship. The gale struck the lighthouse, and as you read from Sanderson's quote, and water dashed into the lower part of the house 10 feet on level and 50 feet from shore. That 10 feet on level is referring to the water as it's coming up against the foundation. There was not 10 feet of water in the house. But the thing that's wrong, totally wrong, and I'm going to have you guys help me explain why, had to flee with his family to the boathouse farther back as the waters tore the walks away from the home. Now, the walks were wood plank. Those moving and floating are possible. But where was Cana built? It's on bedrock. It's on the highest rock on Cana Shoal. It has masonry walls 2 feet thick. The boathouse, where's a boathouse? Well, it's wood, but if you want to keep a boat in it, don't you want the boathouse down on the water? Now, if you're at the top of the island in a brick house with 2 feet of wall around you, are you really going to go outside in the storm to go downhill to sit in a wood shack on the water? Probably not. And mental health would be a concern, yes. Okay, the drowning chickens, that happened fairly frequently. Jesse Brown was appointed keeper in 1891, and he has a connection to Bailey's Harbor today. Over at the Ridges, there's a lady by the name of Judy Brown who's been active as a volunteer for many, many years. Her husband, Jerry, has been active at Cana as one of the docents for a good, coming on 20 years. Jerry's grandfather is Jesse. So that family tradition still lives on today. This is Jesse. He's not really that stern, he just doesn't photograph well. Conrad Stram, who came with his wife and 2 sons, you stayed longer in the season. This was the change that happened between wood-hulled vessels and iron hull. They're not really iron, they're steel hull. With the advent of iron boats, the day of wood was gone, and the day, most assuredly, of sail finally finished, which meant your season ran longer. And I'm going to read the quote to you because I really, really like it. This refers to Conrad Strand's youngest son, who was born at the station. And like all events of the station, it was recorded in the log and a letter sent to the inspector of the district notifying him of the change. Inspector's reports and correspondence were terse, to the point, and generally no levity was engaged. However, receipt is hereby acknowledged of your letter of October 29, 1917, reporting a visitor at your station, which is contrary to the instructions contained in District Circular Letter number 101. You are advised that under the circumstances, the regulations will be waived in your case, and you are authorized to give the visitor permanent residence. The only example of levity in an inspector's memo I've ever seen. He was later transferred to a ship. Oscar Knudsen. And Mr. Knudsen and Assistant Morris made the island what you see today. There was the brush, and there was a lot of, it looked a lot like parts of the ridges, with the creeping juniper and a lot of kind of wind-twisted cedar. It was not a well-dressed station. He got an efficiency for it because he did a very nice job of maintaining and improving the station. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the second paragraph. There's a minor problem with the dates. September 29th, 1919 is the day before the ship sailed out of Buffalo, New York. So there's a good chance it didn't sink. In any event, this occurred on the 5th of October, same year. The Frank O'Connor was something of an anachronism. It's a wood vessel. It's 301 feet in length. It is, at the time, the largest freighter on the lakes, the largest boat. It was a bulk carrier, very similar to what we have today, and she was up lake, meaning she was coming up the lakes from the port of New Buffalo, which is adjacent to Buffalo, New York. And she was carrying anthracite. Anthracite is what we know as hard coal, fuel coal. She made her way up the lakes, and I'd love to tell you the story about the storm and how the ship barely made it through, and none of that would be true. She had smooth sailing. Matter of fact, she was making near record time as she locked through at Detroit and came up the Detroit River, got into the Huron Basin, and proceeded on over through the Straits of Mackinac into Lake Michigan. And that's where things didn't go so good for the O'Connor. Fire broke out in the hold. That's the coal they're carrying. That's their cargo. Recap, wood boat filled with coal on fire. And the captain had the presence of mind to take that vessel as close as his intent was to run it aground on Cana Shoal. Why? Because the value of the cargo exceeded the value of the vessel. Remember, this is a wood vessel in an age of the iron ship. So, his intent was laudable, but he didn't make it. 2.5 miles off Cana, he did something that was very brave, and the crew can be commended for it. They opened the seacocks, and seacocks in a vessel are a way to drain the billages when it's in dry dock and used also as inspection ports. Some of them are pretty big. They opened those at sea, allowing the vessel to flood and sink. The idea being put out the fire, and it did that admirably. The problem with sinking your boat while you're on it means you're kind of short on places to go. So they took to the boats, to the lifeboats, and the keeper, that's Knudsen, rowed out. It's a rowboat, 2.5 miles out, big rowboat. He and his assistants gathered the boats from the O'Connor together, and with their help, he didn't row 3 boats back by himself, but with their help came back to Cana. Now, he gets near shore, and you get down to the bottom part where it says, came within a quarter, I don't know if it's on here, came within a quarter mile of shore and turned crew of Frank O'Connor over to the guard. There's a note of, I don't know, disappointment, but he did all the rescuing, he and his assistant, provided safety for those men on that boat. And then when he's 1,200 feet from shore, the Coast Guard shows up. So there's a little bit of friction between the two services. U.S. Lighthouse Service and the U.S. Life Saving Service are not yet melded into one entity. Okie dokie, he got transferred. This is Cliff. He was assistant to his father, and he came back to serve as keeper at Cana. He was here in Door County before that. He was at Dunlap Reef, which is also a range system, or was, that existed to provide the alignment that you needed to do 2 things. One, get lined up as you come out of the Bay of Green Bay to get yourself situated on going through the channel, gets you under the bridge. Remember, that's one bridge. Oh, wait, we only have one bridge working now. Anyway, get lined up to go through the canal. If you're inbound from the lake, you'd use the range lights in reverse to maintain the turn where you come out of the channel. That's the cut that goes through the canal to get yourself lined up to go out into the waters of Green Bay. All righty, he was replaced by Mr. Wright. This is Sanderson. He was replaced by Wright. Wright was with us until the beginning of World War II. And that's Cliff. Keep on going. And you go down to the bottom of that list. I know you're all thrilled to read every one of those names. Down at the bottom, Michael Dresden. It says on there he was there from 33 through 41. He was actually there longer. Mike Dresden was the last keeper of Cana. He received the appointment when Sanderson retired. Now, that's the second Sanderson. He was the only keeper at Cana to accept induction into the service. The keepers had an option. They could remain keeper and retire as keeper. And keeper had the status of a ship's master. It's a captain. It's an officer. If you elected to join the service, you lost your officership. You became a bosun first class. In other words, the equivalent of a staff sergeant in the Army. So it would be a lot of them considered a downgrade. And even though the military would include benefits such as access to pension money, they turned their back on it, felt that they were being dismissed. Which brings us to another set of lights called Bailey's Harbor and a whole other set of people.
Whole other set of people. We had 8 keepers at Bailey's Harbor range lights. Fabian Trudell was appointed when he was 74 years old. He stayed here 2 years. It probably got to be quite a task taking that lard up and down the range light and keeping that upper range light lantern fueled. Marcus Shaler succeeded Trudell, and there's to read more about that, the devastating fire that went through Bailey's Harbor. That's probably another interesting thing. Anyhow, the lights were spared, and 2 years later came typhoid fever. His wife attended those who fell ill to the typhoid fever. She herself passed away at the age of 43 in 1975. He stayed on as keeper a few more months before he resigned his post in 1875 and returned to Green Bay. He was replaced by Joseph Harris Jr. The Harris family has an interesting history here. His father was involved in about everything. People probably known Harris mostly through their association with the Door County Advocates. They were very active members of the community, founding the Bailey's Harbor Literary Club. One of the only known photos that we've been able to find of Joseph Harris Jr. Then there was the keeper who wasn't. Burke Caswell is kind of an interesting case. He was an American frontiersman. He was stationed at Big Sable Point Lighthouse. When he was appointed here, he decided he would resign rather than coming to Bailey's Harbor. I don't know why. He couldn't have probably come to a better lighthouse. And then we have a couple of lighthouse keepers. The history is kind of sketchy on Larson and Hansen and Millage. There's some things out there. They didn't really stand out as much as Henry Gaddai did. He transferred from the Sturgeon Bay Ship Canal Station when he got his keeper's bars. Henry, I guess what's so fun about playing Henry is he was known to be an eligible bachelor when he came here. Henry was born in Belgium in 1865. There's Henry. Maybe that's why, yeah, pretty good-looking guy to say so, but he never neglected his lighthouse keeping duties, even though he was out socializing. His lighthouse was described as being neat and bright as a new pin. Well, we were fortunate to actually find Henry's appointment letter in the National Archives. Henry out in front of the range light around 1907. We talked about those keeper logs. Here's Henry's log. Pretty nice, very nice entries. Most of it is weather related again, except for one interesting entry on this log in February of 1901, right about in here. It says 4 p.m., my wedding. So that may be this other picture here. It looks about like Henry's age then. Maybe that was his bachelor's party. Henry with his wife, Eve Gaddai. She was previously Eve Henrik, a local Bailey's Harbor girl. And when they got married, it said Henry broke a lot of hearts in Bailey's Harbor. Interesting thing that lighthouse keepers kind of knew one another. There was a lighthouse keeper named William Duclon over at Eagle Bluff Lighthouse. They had 7 boys. Those boys had the Duclon family band, and it was written up in the Door County Advocate that at Henry's wedding, the Duclon band played for Henry and Eve's wedding, and it said they partied into the wee hours of the morning, and that people attending that wedding had such a good time they wanted Henry and Eve to get married once a month afterwards. Interesting thing about Eve, she's a twin. She had a twin brother, and her brother's name was Adam. So it's like Adam and Eve. Henry, a little later on, he looks a little different. That's why I don't have to worry about sporting a mustache when I interpret Henry. The their 40th wedding anniversary. A lot of visitors came to the range lights. We know this happened in 1910 because of the back of the postcard. It was the back of a postcard dated right up in here. Interesting, the people that sent it says we also had a puncture on the back tire just south of Kewanee. Now, lighthouses were social places. The range lights were close to town. People would come out and visit all the time. Had a great time, more visitors at the range light. Henry had a wonderful 1912 Buick he was really proud of. We'll move on to the Bailey's Harbor lower range light, taken about 1907. It needed some pretty drastic repairs then. You can see how badly it was rotted out. This was 1973. This was Roy Lucas' time here, and it looked really grand after it was spruced up again. It got all new siding. They used hemlock siding. Now, and looking good in 1987. Pretty darn good there. You see both lighthouses in line. Well, 1993, it needed another restoration. The siding rotted out. Replaced it with all new siding. They used, I was told, southern white pine. Probably one of the mistakes they made, they didn't back prime it or paint the front when they put it on. So unfortunately, here we find ourselves in 2013, and it's looking pretty shabby again. The siding was rotting away. So part of the problem, it's at about 7 feet from the edge of Ridges Road. Snow got pushed up against it in the winter, it just causing it to rot out with all the moisture. So we had gotten permission from the Historical Society, because we are on the Register of Historical Sites, that we could move it 15 feet from its present location. It was put on rails, jacked up, and moved to a new foundation. We removed all the old siding, put some plywood sheathing on for strength. Its structure was basically a skeleton of wood timbers. New foundation, got a new roof, and that's how it looked when it was finished in July of 2013. A view from the upper range light, and it's kind of interesting. There's the bell buoy out in the harbor. Coast Guard installed that bell buoy in 1939. Now, decommissioning and relighting of the range lights. In 1960, this was late 60s, one of the last known pictures of the range lights when they were still active. Roy Lucas was living in the lighthouse at the time. He was teaching at Gibraltar High School. He came home one November evening, and there was lingering traces of cigarette smoke in the house. And the only other ones beside Roy that had a key was the Coast Guard. So when he went up into the lantern room here, he noticed that the lantern and the Fresnel lens were gone. Went down to the front range light. Its lantern and lens were gone. Why? Well, he understood why this concrete pad went in there. Coast Guard came and put up this day marker with a leading light up on the top. It took the place of the range lights. They went dark. So we thought, well, why can't we turn those lights on and have them lit and stay on all the time after we did that restoration of the lower range light? Talked to the Coast Guard, got a hold of the right people in aids to navigation, and they said, well, sure you can. You can be a private aid to navigation, and it was June 11th of last year that they were relit, and they've been on since. We're on the light list and the navigation charts again. August of that last year, the Coast Guard came and removed the day board and the leading light. That's what it looks like with it gone. And actually this last March, the Coast Guard contracted with somebody to come and take out the pad, so there's really nothing there anymore to tell that that tower was there. Here's what they look like from out in the harbor. Wanted to get a picture of them lit up, but we were out there in 3- and 4-foot waves. My wife wasn't too thrilled about that. We were out there with some friends. Took a lot of pictures as we're going by, camera bouncing around, and that's the best one that I got. So it still gives the effect. They look pretty darn good. So actually need to get out and get a better picture, and I'd like to see what it looks like when it's totally dark and all you see is the lights. This is the light that was in the lower range light lantern that the Coast Guard gave us in 1996 so we could light it up for special occasions. They gave us this one so we could exhibit a red light in that lower range light. So what happened to the lenses? Well, when we were doing the historic structures report for the restoration of the rear range light and its outbuildings, my wife did a lot of research into the history of the Ridges Lighthouse archives. She came across this letter from Roy Lucas to a member of the Ridges, and then Roy said, well, one of our board members, Mike Madden, was sure that he saw one of the range light lenses and lanterns down at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum in Manitowoc. So it's like, I checked with Roy back at the beginning of this year in Charlotte, and did it ever get any follow-up on that? And they never did. So Charlotte got me a contact down there, and I checked, and they said, sure it is. This is a picture. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a picture that Roy took of the lens when it was still in the front range light. Well, the curator replied back, yeah, we do have that lens. There it is. It's being exhibited in the museum. And how did it get there? Well, turns out that the Coast Guard commander at Station 2 Rivers donated it to the Maritime Museum in 1970. Coincidentally, the Coast Guard found that same information out at the same time I did, and maybe it wasn't supposed to have gone there. The Coast Guard maybe lost control of some of its artifacts at the time. The Coast Guard couldn't claim ownership to it. The museum had a form that spelled out that transfer. Well, the museum actually, a little later on, decided to turn ownership of that lens back to the Coast Guard. So my thoughts are it'd be lovely to have it come back home to Bailey's Harbor. It can't go in the range light because it needs to be in a conditioned environment, but it would sure look good behind the information counter at the New Ridges Nature Center, lit up. I can envision a nice mural on the wall with either lighthouses or the lake. It'd be perfect there. The rear range light lens, well, where did that go? This is a picture, close-up that Roy took of that. There are rumors out there that it's around. I'm trying to follow up with that. The Coast Guard curator is doing some checking. Probably better that one of their own checks rather than somebody from outside the service. It could possibly be down at Coast Guard Station Milwaukee in the commander's office. So we'll keep you posted on that. Restorations efforts then and now, well, 1993, we had a new roof installed. These are pictures that Paul Rene had taken as it was going on. Kind of get an idea of, here's some of the original cedar that was under there. It was painted red, or it was dipped in stain. They put some asphalt on there. There were a number of roofs that went on there over that period of time. So now we're starting a new preservation restoration effort. Laura Davis is our preservation architect. She's starting the condition assessment for the HSR, stands for Historic Structures Report. Eric Pyle and Laura are doing an assessment of the upper part of the building. Actually, you can see back. I'm surprised that this roof was put on in 1993, that it deteriorated that fast. Usually, you might expect to see granules falling off or shingles curling, but to actually be losing tabs like that, so we need a new roof before we go through another winter. So what do we want to achieve in this restoration? The end goal is a living museum, as it was in the keeper's time. We chose a period of significance of 1896 to 1923 when Henry Gattai was the keeper. And well, how was that look determined? Well, it was based on a picture with a known date. What's that picture? Because that's the period that we set that we wanted the front range light, lower range light to be restored to. How do we know that it was that date? Well, again, it's on the back side of a postcard. So we could actually kind of date a lot of our pictures, other pictures. What do we want to do in this? What do we need to do? The owner's objectives. We have to identify, evaluate, and treat adverse conditions, prioritize maintenance needs, preserve historic building elements and create a living museum. We also want to educate visitors about the range lights, and we want to establish even more of a dedicated team of volunteers for maintaining that lighthouse and pursue artifacts that are appropriate to the time period, and somewhat make it able to, once we get it restored, have it support itself. Things have been added and subtracted to the range light. Actually, not really subtracted. We're fortunate that not a lot has been subtracted. We've got the windows added here. Well, we're not going to change that. There was a nice medallion up above the window here. We'll recreate there. And we need to recreate that ventilator ball. Had shutters on it. Actually, we're fortunate. We have found in the oil house the pair of shutters that had been used on it, and we can copy. Additive changes, the vestibule, storm windows. Storm windows were actually a good thing. They preserved the other windows, the sashes. Basement access was added and a plumbing stack. More changes, a modern kitchen, modern bathroom, central heat, electricity, hot water, cabinetry. Well, we'll do some restoring back to the period of time. Some of those fall outside the period of significance. It didn't get plumbing until it was used, and a lot was the other thing I didn't mention. The Bailey's Harbor Lutheran Church used it as a parsonage from 1930 to 1955. A number of people here said they had, in town, heard had catechism. We'll restore the inside. What did we find? Additive changes, some insulation, but not a lot. Carpeting, wallpaper, and a lot of wallpaper. We tried taking some of it off. The wallpaper came incidentally in the when it was a parsonage. The Lighthouse service would have never put. They painted everything. Would have been painted white. Wonderful wood floors. Dwight and I actually, what was it, last year? We took the carpeting off those stairs. It's a lot easier to climb now because it was double padded, made it pretty tricky. Found more wood floors upstairs, trap doors, old newspapers. This we found out, this is in the parlor. What we found here, there was carpeting. Under the carpeting was linoleum. Under that was a layer of 1/4-inch pressboard. Wall to wall under the pressboard was tar paper under that, and just the gray area was layers of newspapers from 1944 and 1945. Probably put that under the carpeting that they previously had there as insulation and padding. Upstairs we found here's the, if you didn't want to have the wood stove going upstairs, a floor vent in the ceiling below that let the heat from those wood stoves rise upstairs. We need the new roofing, obviously. Have to do some paint scraping and repainting. Some repairs on the, a little deterioration on the soffit, the front porch. They repaired the columns with what's called the Dutchman. That needs to be fixed up. And the porch floor needs some work, but it's all restorable. Inside, repair some windows. If you look on the lantern room on the west side of the building, you see a shutter on the outside. This is the inside. That shutter is there because the stops are missing from the window. Otherwise, we'd have water coming in when it rains. Do some work on the rim lock door hardware that was there, and repair some plaster. We need some repairs on the stucco foundation. We took some off to find that the foundation itself is in very good shape. In some places, maybe the parging is letting loose. Restore doors and windows. And here's the shutter we found. We'll replicate shutters.
When Ed talks about the doors on the range light, on the rear range light, are original to the house, 1869 construction. When we restored the exterior doors on Cana, they were missing. They were modern doors. And we used the doors as models to complete the restoration of Cana's exterior.
Okay, so we'll move on. So again, we want to replicate this ventilator that's missing, this little detail here, and bury the electrical feed to the house so that it's not as obvious in a 1900 look. Inside, remove wallpaper, refinish wood trim and doors, floors, replace the heating system so it's not quite as intrusive as what the water baseboards are, and replace the lovely ceiling fan light fixtures. If anybody's interested in those after we take them out, let me know. Now we'll get back to Dwight's part.
Alrighty. Well, what we've shown you for a while this evening is perhaps a day in the life of a keeper and what some of the things and tasks that they had. What I'd like to do is share with you a day in my life at Cana Island. It begins near dawn. Well, that dawn, I lost my dawn, there's dawn. Begins at dawn, and as the day progresses, you start to get those wispy clouds that mariners called mare's tails, the forefront of a front and the beginning of an oncoming storm. The storm comes in later and higher. That foreground where the water looks flat, well, that's the result of the change in air pressure. You see the waves are beginning to break off the shoal, and the water that normally covers the shoal is being drawn out into the lake. Clouds thicken. As you look at the bottom, the waves get higher. You know something? That offshore wind is starting to tear the waves apart. At this point, the waves are pushing 4 to 6 feet. It looks like it's getting clearer. Well, maybe not really. If you look down along the horizon, the clouds are getting thicker still, the waves are getting taller, and the wind is strengthening even more. Calm? Well, not entirely. This is what it looks like when you look out past the shoreline. All that wave activity, all that storm activity, well, that storm is still going. This was taken with a telephoto lens. The vessel is downbound, meaning it's heading toward Milwaukee, Chicago. And it's far out. It's in the East Channel. Cana Island is just about 9 miles. It's 9.5 miles to 12.5 miles out from the island. Storm clouds are thickening and thickening. And this one, well, I wanted to share with you. For one, I have a propensity for taking pictures of storms. But the thing I wanted to share is right down here. See that little whirlpool? That's water flowing off the island back into the lake. At this point, we're starting to flood. The waves are in excess of 12 feet now. And yes, I am outside taking pictures of this. There is some suspicion as to the quality of my mental health. But nonetheless, evening breaks, the storm passes, and you'll note that there's a light on. Well, it was true in the day that when a person was hired by the service, they were charged with the following: that a keeper shall at all times maintain a good light at the station. Now, I submit that good light is much more than mechanics. Cana's light is lit, as is the Bailey's range lights. And they do provide a navigational function. And they are indeed a good light. But there's another light. And that light is the memory, the remembrances, the stories and history of those who have gone before us. And that light needs to be maintained also, for that is the light of history. And on behalf of Ed and myself, we'd like to thank you for sharing that good light. Thank you. We are available. Keep in mind who you're talking to. Ed and I are available for questions discussing lighthouses indefinitely. Although we do need to be fed occasionally.
Well, if you need to be fed, please, there are
Well, like I said, we're talking about lighthouses, so
Oh.
we'll get. Question?
Was there any difference in?
Oh, could I just give you the mic? That way it goes on the recording.
Was there any difference in pay or social status of range light keepers as compared to the tower light keepers and light ship keepers?
A keeper of station was paid based on the station, based on the duty. In other words, a keeper would be paid more than an assistant. First assistant would be paid higher than a second. So where are you working? Who are you? And what you doing? Interestingly enough, in the service, there was no distinction between gender. A woman would be paid the same rate based on station of assignment, time and duty, and rank. That didn't change until the Suffrage Act, and the government decided to change things to make things more equal for women, and most of the lighthouse women keepers were unfortunately demoted. There you go.
I noticed one of the things that you talked about when you had an assistant, many times it was a wife of the keeper. Were there any instances where there was a lighthouse keeper and a female assistant that was not their wife?
Let me give you a summary. No. Remember the period we're talking about. That's a little bit too progressive.
I'm
You're-
surprised to even hear that they accepted the wives of the keepers as assistant keepers. I was surprised to see that.
The wife not only often would be an assistant. Shame on you. No, I'm staying in one spot. But upon the demise of the keeper, it was oft times that the wife would be placed in his stead. We've got an example of that happening here in Door County at the Sherwood Point Station. Keeper met a natural demise. He died, and his wife replaced him. Unfortunately, in that case, that is not the end of the story. Maybe. You see, it's possible that she's still there. For she was a particular woman. Particular in style, particular in how she kept the house, and particular in means. Everything was just so. Well, after her passing and leaving the station, the Coast Guard took over. Now, the Coast Guard is primarily populated by young gentlemen who have housekeeping standards that are slightly different. And this resulted occasionally in conflict. Oh, she was particular. She, at one time, the Coast Guard had left the kitchen in, well, I guess politely would be called disarray. And they rose after midnight with a loud thumping and crashing and banging, and awoke. And the Coast Guard then awoke, and they finally hollered down, well, if you're going to be up and making all that racket, the least you can do is clean up. And the story goes, the following morning, the house and kitchen was put in order. Now, Cana itself is not haunted. However, in the event that a haunting is available, this is the type of spirit we're looking for. Other questions? Commentary? That's it for 147 years? Again, thank you very, very much.
Thank you both so very much. That was interesting. And just from a little personal point of view, one of the little items that I loved the most was seeing that picture of Henry Gatai and his wife Eve. Because I knew her, I didn't know her, I was just a little kid. But, you know, I saw her around. And the person I saw was a very tiny, very white-haired lady, almost always, I think, wearing a hat and a coat, it seemed like, in my memory anyway. But it was just, in my mind, that's who she was. And then I just saw this picture of this beautiful young woman in those mutton chop sleeves. It was just kind of a neat thing. And their home, you know, if you have an interest, is, it's right next to that market building where it has What Next, and it has a red geranium. Okay, just the house just north of there was Henry and Eve Gateye's house. And it's always looked really neat and perfect like that.
Actually,
Yeah.
their great niece lives there now.
Yeah, oh, their niece, great niece lives there. And you know something, I'm angry with myself because I saw they're up and I should have knocked on the door probably and told them you were going to be here. Oh, well.